Kell affirms, our first contention is the healthcare collapse. Current conditions make for a risky industry. As Byron 17 writes that healthcare is ranked as the #1 systemic recession risk, with spending forecasted to grow by an average of 5.6% annually in the coming decade. COVID only makes matters worse. As Cooper 20 writes that COVID is chewing through supplies, working staff to the bone, losing millions of enrollees. Analysts predict a 40% hike in premiums to cover these costs. Soon, premiums will be unsustainably high, as Altman 18 writes that family premiums could rise to 100% of U.S. median household income by 2033 if trends continue squeezing private resources that could be devoted to other priorities. This brings the economy to a breaking point. Harrigan in 2016 of NC State writes that healthcare will consume more than 50% of the U.S. economy by the year 2060, an unsustainable point because of all the other things that it would have to crowd out. This gives the government a binary choice. Lopez 17 of Business Insider writes that investors see rising costs as a bubble that will either be gently deflated through government intervention or violently popped by the market. We can handle rising costs with good policies, or we can do nothing, which would result in more rising costs and a recession as household income and resources go towards medicine and treatment instead of consumer goods. Fortunately, a single-payer system solves the cost crisis. It alters payment incentives and provides everyone with access while also increasing administrative efficiency. Dave 17 in an empirical study finds that high cost raises insurance premiums, making it difficult for many to afford coverage. These uninsured individuals end up costing the healthcare system more due to delayed care and preventable hospitalization, making lack of insurance partly responsible for inefficient care. Additionally, large degree of administrative costs pervades our system precisely due to multiple payers because of the private plans and the public plans. For example, Medicare spends only 2% of its expenditures on administrative costs compared to the 17% of revenues for the private industry. The impact is a recession. COVID-19 has put the U.S. at the brink of a second shock. As Rob 20 of MarketPlot writes that U.S. recession in March was short and is now over, but we're vulnerable to another adverse development. A U.S. recession would end up spilling over. As Rizal in 2020 writes that the U.S. economy contributes to half the world's stock market, 15% of global GDP, and is a crucial import market. This spillover would decimate the globe. As Bradford 13 writes, as many as 900 million people could fall back into poverty in the event of another economic shock like the Great Recession. Our second contention concerns big data. The current system is primitive. As Rawl 20 of Japan Times writes, that data is not transferable between doctors or medical systems without a patient's directive, which inexplicably is often required by sending a fax. Luckily, Medicare-For-All would be the solution, as Madley 19 of The Scientist writes that with Medicare-For-All, patient data won't be segregated by insurance plan or withheld by private hospitals clinging to profits. A national system would allow centralized electronic medical data, and in single-payer systems such as that in Canada, chronic disease suffers less, fewer life-threatening complications, and increased lifespan because of this centralized system. Overall, this centralized system is amazing. Rawl 20 continues that patient records are stored in a central online database accessible to physicians, pharmacists, and other caregivers, regardless of where you are or when you need care. This is critical to tackle the inevitable crisis of superbugs. As Waxman 16 of Stat News writes that globally, superbugs are estimated to kill 10 million people per year by 2050 if we don't take effective action. Luckily, the best way to take action is through centralizing data with Medicare-For-All. Jared 18 writes that using mathematical modeling, researchers demonstrated that if hospitals and nursing homes in the same area coordinated their efforts, infection rates could be reduced by as much as 74%. Ultimately, the whole system demonstrator in 2011 finds that the use of telehealth technology can reduce patient mortality rates by up to 45%. For these reasons, we affirm.
Let me know if anything cuts out or whatever. I'll try to clarify if it's too big. Just verbally start me. Is anyone not ready? We negate the resolution resolved the United States should enact the Medicare-For-All Act of 2019. Contention one as an economic disaster. Enacting Medicare-For-All would create a financial disaster in low-income countries in two ways. The first is through debt. House 18 of George Mason University confirms that doubling all federal taxes can't fully finance the plan, even assuming that payment rates are reduced by 40%. Thus, he concludes that Medicare-For-All would increase the federal budget by $32 trillion during its first 10 years. This leads to a spike in interest rates because buying bonds is a zero-sum game. Lombard 09 shows us for every 1 percentage point increase to the deficit-to-GDP ratio, interest rates rise by 25 basis points. This hurts low-income countries because BBC 18 notes that higher U.S. interest rates lure back in investors who would look for returns abroad. Thus, Jubilee 15 explains in the past, when U.S. interest rates increased in the 90s, 2 decades of development were lost and poverty increased by 125 billion in sub-Saharan Africa. The second is through decreasing remittances. Currently, Rappaport 18 finds that 1 in 4 doctors in the United States were born in another country. This is largely due to higher wages. Baker 17 notes we pay doctors twice as much as physicians in other wealthy countries. Tori 12 explains that immigrant physicians practicing in the United States benefit their country of origin by sending money back home. For Philippines, for example, such remittances were estimated to represent 10% of the country's GDP. Sadly, this vital cash supply decreased on Medicare for All. Dixon 18 notes that there is no relief valve for physicians facing up to 40% pay cuts. Empirically, Gibbons 18 notes the higher salaries of 10% correspond with 3.3% more remittances. The impact is poverty. Mahmoud of Bookings 20 explains that a decline in remittances of 20% will push 60 million into extreme poverty around the world. Contention 2 is innovation. Whitman 09 says the openness of the US system to new technologies is evidenced by having twice as many MRI scanners as other developed countries. Sadly, Medicare for All will cause massive uncertainty in the market. Luther 19 notes that the Secretary would have discretion in interpreting what specific services are medically necessary. That means political leanings could sway what's covered from administration to administration. Leach 11 finds that healthcare reform causes uncertainty for investors. That could limit the ability of medical device companies to bring products to market and from being developed altogether. The impact is medical technology. Cliff 15 notes that money in the United States allows device manufacturers to experiment with groundbreaking experiments which effectively are subsidizing medical innovations that proliferate across the globe. Thus, Hansen 15 concludes that with the right investments, we could save 10 million deaths every year. Contention 3 is subsidizing healthcare. Low-income countries get drugs at a very discounted rate. Switch 11 notes that developing countries pay 6% of the cost such in industrialized countries for essential drugs. U.S. market is especially crucial. Goldman 18 from USC explains that U.S. consumers account for about 80% of total global pharmaceutical profits. Low prices are critical. The WHO notes that 90% of the population in low-income countries purchase medicine through out-of-pocket payments, and any slight increase would shut a lot of people out. Medicare for All would destroy this current system in two ways, and the first is by decreasing profits. Medicare for All implements reference pricing where pharmaceuticals can charge more than OECD countries than the United States. While this sounds really good in theory, Dr. Mel 18 finds that actions to restrict prices have real effects on drug affordability in less wealthy countries because the market for prescription drugs is propped up by high prices in the United States. The second is by taking out a PR incentive. Yale 19 notes that tiered pricing is a result from strong public pressure, whereas manifestations of philanthropy. However, Medicare for All means you sell drugs directly to the government, which means you don't need to maintain this PR. For these two reasons, prices would have to increase as there is a focus on short-term profits. Finn 09 finds the firm maximizes its sales by selling at the price that only the top 10% can afford. Luckily, the current system doesn't do this because Danson 03 concludes that the current system of price discrimination has increased access in low-income countries by a factor of roughly 7 times. The impact is increasing infections in lesser-income countries. Without the WHO quantifies that during the decade of vaccines, introduction and increased coverage of current model vaccines are projected to avert over 14 million deaths. Ultimately, we see benefits across the globe. Taylor 14 furthers that global pharmaceutical companies have already provided health interventions enough to help up to 540 million people. Because we think the status quo is really good. We negate. Yeah.
I'm going to take the first question, if that's cool with you.
Yeah.
Okay. So you say, like, in the developing world, there's 6% of what the United States has to pay, right? Like, for the price of drugs?
Yeah, for that compared to industrialized countries.
Right. So, like, give me, like, a specific number. Like, how much are they paying? Because I feel like it's proportional to their income, right? Like, people in the United States make more money than people in the developing world. So a 6% decrease from the United States doesn't equivalent to people accessing.
Yeah, so it's not a 6% decrease, it's 6% of 100%, right? That there's a big difference in that number. But second, we'd say that, yeah, you're right. The reason why they charge lower is so more people can have access, but it's not where they make the most money. We'd say under an affirmative world, when they don't have the capacity, or they don't have the incentive, or their incentive doesn't matter because the capacity means that they have to hike up prices and make more revenue.
How does that make sense? Like, why would you hike up prices in the developing world? How does that work?
Because they make more money that way, but they don't have to care about it right now.
Wait. No, I understand, like, what your argument is. But, like, if people cannot pay for drugs and you're making it more expensive now in the developing world, how does that all of a sudden recoup profits?
Right, because you charge more in the upper and middle class. The upper middle class and the people that are already super well off. That's why the link is true. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
On big data, your evidence talks a lot, like they hint around single payer, but specifically the Medicare for All. What data does Medicare for All collect? Like, what is it centralized?
Yeah, like patient data. So whether, like, it be age, conditions that you have,
is it patient
that you be allergic to?
Is it patient data or doctor data?
Patient data. It's in the bill. So you can control data.
I mean, your evidence, right? Doesn't say that, right? It says U.S. needs to, like, for example, the Japan Times evidence that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You're saying, like, the evidence says that we need centralized data, right? Does it say Medicare for All?
Yeah, like, read the Madley evidence. It's the first one I sent you, and it says that patient data won't be segregated.
Won't be segregated, but does it mean that they're going to collect the patient data? I have the points made. Sure, you can have a question.
Okay, let's go back to like this, like the upper middle class and the rich people in the developing world are ending up buying these drugs, right? How big is the upper middle class and the
Yeah, so we'd say in low-income countries, there's a lot of like inequality, right? That's why that's possible. Right?
So, like,
that's why you can charge a lot more in like the elites, but we'd say like right now they don't want to do that because of stuff like PR, stuff like.
Actually, do they have enough elites to recoup the cost already?
Yes. Just
Then why
like
don't
if
they
you want to
sell
see,
high?
just look for the Fin evidence, right? It says that the
Ooh.
firm maximizes its profits by shutting out 90% in low-income countries.
Why don't they just sell high now then? If they're
Because they
making
don't. So yeah, two warrants. First is they don't have to. Second is PR. We'd say this goes away. But like the reasons why they do it is irrelevant, right? Because
Okay.
if you don't have the capacity anymore, then it doesn't matter anymore. It's like 10 seconds.
Okay, cool. In that case, time starts. When there's something now. First, on their first contention talking about debt, there's a couple of issues here. First, it's not going to be an economic disaster. Medicare-For-All actually saves money on the long term. Galvani of Yale Public Health establishes a single-payer health system. It's actually going to lead to 13% of savings in healthcare expenditure, equivalent to $450 billion annually. This is also important because it actually shrinks our deficit. As Friedman 13 explains, that Medicare-For-All would reduce the deficit by $154 billion in the first year due to the adoption of progressive financing, meaning that over time, the healthcare system in the U.S. is currently becoming more expensive, as stated in our contention 1, and by getting rid of all of these expenses, we're decreasing the deficit on net, literally solving for their debt impacts because we no longer are spending as much and no longer creating as much. On that note, we have been increasing the amount of debt the United States has been going in for years. We don't see a substantial interest rates increasing. We don't see substantial harms to the developing world. You haven't triggered any of their impacts. They need to prove the probability that Medicare-For-All specifically will push us over the edge at the point where we've been going on this trend for a long period of time. But then you also can't say it's viable to pass it through debt in the first place because the resolution actually to look at the bill, and Bernie's bill specifically is talking about taxes in the first place. And on top of that, Guyman 16 establishes that taxes are more likely in the first place on top of that because it's most likely going to be funded by a progressive tax system. But on top of that, debts and deficits don't actually matter if the economy can afford it. 40 years proved their argument about bonds is false, as Taney establishes that investors are not remotely worried about the Treasury's ability to pay back. They're not worried about bond sales. They're not worried about all of this increase in inflation rates, which is why we've never had to do it in the past. Then, when they're talking about emerging markets specifically, there are a couple of issues here. First, after recent economic stimulus, Nichols 09 establishes that single payer would be a major stimulus for the U.S. economy with 2.6 million jobs, $317 billion in new revenue, and at $100 billion in wages. This is a massive economic growth, which specifically helps emerging markets, as Aurora 04 establishes a 1% increase in U.S. growth is correlated with an average of 1% increase in growth in other countries. They literally not only solve for the fact that there's deficit, we also solve for the growth in the other countries. And at the point where the investors who invest in bonds are typically different than the ones who invest in the developing world because it's a riskier investment, you're never actually going to see them pull out in the first place. Going on their second link, talking about remittances, a couple of issues here. First, the Paris evidence indicts their 40% card and establishes that the Medicare-For-All system, because it's a single system, has fewer hours of uncompensated administrative time and lower overhead and lower office staff, which means that they're actually going to be on net it cutting administrative waste and corporate profits, not doctor incomes. They're still going to have the same, if not higher pay, because NARA 19 establishes the Medicare-For-All will cut down administrative time, meaning they're going to go to more patients, getting more money long term. But second, remittances come from a lot of sources in the first place. So even if you believe that doctors are a significant source, specifically one demographic of the U.S. population, a specific job isn't going to be more substantial than the rest of the economy, the rest of the other countries. There's always going to be a lot of remittances. But even if you don't believe that, their impact is already going to be triggered. COVID is decreasing the amount of remittances by 14%, specifically because of high spending. Even our case on healthcare collapse, talking about how the economy is increasingly getting pressured out by healthcare costs, means that if healthcare costs continue to rise, these people are not going to have enough money to actually go and pay remittances in the first place. That's the entire economy, not just doctors. Then on stage 2, talking about all this medical technology, Sullivan 18 establishes that U.S. consumers are last in line to actually benefit from medical technology, as companies are going to Europe and emerging economies to support the U.S. There's a couple warrants, because the U.S. financial systems disincentivize radical disruptive innovations right now. Going to a government system isn't going to change that. There's never actually going to be the expansion in medical technology to us. Then on their contention 3, talking about subsidizing the developing world, a couple of issues. First, the cost isn't actually going to go down. The U.S. National Library of Medicine establishes that even if you cut prices 20%, the increase in accessibility from more demand for the drugs is going to go up 23%, leading to an on-net revenue loss of only 1%. That's really important because it's never actually going to destroy these profits in the first place. They're going to be able to recoup the cost in the United States. But even then, they will never be pulling out of the developing world, specifically on the PR pressure, because they still have to have PR for the governments who are going to be giving them contracts in the first place. And even if the government is buying the drugs, drugs. Patients are still deciding which drugs they're going to use. PR still matters because these patients are still making the decisions. They're always going to choose the better PR because that's the incentive they have in the first place. Then on the impact level, they're never going to pull from the developing world for 3 reasons. First is profits. Lichtenberg establishes they're never actually fundamentally able to increase prices because otherwise they will lose revenue. Second is future demand. Suzuki establishes that the middle class is forecasted to go $3 billion in the developing world. If they decrease the accessibility, they're going to be pulling out of these markets, losing out on potential growth and potential economic benefits that are going to come from that.
On C1 of debt, we concede the dealing that the deficit doesn't matter. Interest rates will never go up. We kick out of this. We just time suck them. Haha. Let's go to remittances. On remittances, they tell you about Paris. The problem with Paris is they talk about administrative hours. We say you prefer probability. When we look to the UK and Canada, they cut from doctor wages first. The reason why is because even if there's administrative overcost, these private hospitals want to be maintaining the most amount of profit, which is why they're always cutting out of doctors. The rest of the responses group them. It's scalar. Let's go to MedTech C2. Problem is, they talk about Sullivan. They don't give you a warrant into why, like, the United States is bad for innovation right now. We say you prefer our warranting that tells you it's actually really, really good because we're incentivizing investors to go more into medical technology. But secondly, our link literally is a prerequisite. Even if they go into Europe or other places, you get the most amount of innovation from the US because we're subsidizing the cost. Let's go to C3 now. First, on this, like, a 1% profit, the problem with this analysis, it analyzes that there's just, like, a general increase in the amount of, like, access, and it was, like, back in, like, 2009. The problem is, we've seen insurance been expanding, that's why there's only going to be 10% increase in demand. It does not offset anything. But secondly, you prefer Mellow that tells you that you have to be increasing prices even if you have a decrease because it's zero-sum game. Even if it decreases by 1%, that 1% is going to be really, really bad for people. On their thing about profits, 2 responses. One comes from Flynn. The reason why you increase profits is because the only top 10% can afford. The reason why this matters in this case is because, like, there's so much inequality in the developing world that if you increase prices for just the top 10%, it recoups everything. But also, 2, Mellow is still really good here. Let's go to their case. On the top of healthcare collapse, they don't give you any brink, they don't give you a bright line, which means that if we can prove to you any links onto why the AF would cause one sooner, it's a go for us. Let's do that right now. First, it's going to be speculation. Drupal 17 basically notes that whenever you affirm, what's going to happen is that you're changing everything from a private system to a public system. This increases the amount of speculatory investment because now bonds are getting overvalued. We don't know how there's so much uncertainty in the market. Why this matters is because 11 out of the last 12 recessions were caused by this uncertainty, which means that you cause an economic shock as soon as you affirm. The reason why this outweighs is because healthcare costs only decrease after 4 years, which means that we outweigh this on time frame. That same time frame weighting goes for the rest of the turns. Let's do read another turn. Second, Pipes 20 notes that Medicare-For-All would evaporate insurance companies as Carrot 17 notes that insurance would have to liquidate investments in other healthcare companies and sectors, which is why Pipes conclude that it should crash the healthcare sector, which is a fifth of our economy, which also outweighs the time frame. But next, Spiegel notes that what's basically happening, another like this out here. Spiegel basically notes that what's happening is the people are expanding employment right now because they're able to write that off in their taxes, and that's why we see employment increasing. The problem is whenever you get rid of employee-sponsored insurance, is what they're doing, you're going to be getting rid of this incentive, which is why Byman 16 finds that you'll be losing 11.16 jobs, and each job is going to be increasing the GDP by 0.2%, which means you basically outweigh here. Let's talk specifically about this, like, bubble, this impact bubble evidence. First, the NCBI notes that, like, basically what their bubble evidence is saying, that you're taking spending out of the economy, and because what's been happening, they're saying you're replacing, like, government spending with a form of, like, stimulus spending. The problem is, Jacob's 19 cents, that out-of-pocket spending is what's going to actually be, like, allowing for, like, the bubble to be, like, steady in the status quo, because that's how you get, like, the amount of investors. We say you weigh all returns right now on actor incentive. When we look at investors in other places, they look at how safe the market is. They don't look at it like people can get access, which is why the bubble is more likely to pop in their world. Let's go to C2 on big data. First, a turn from Anderson. Basically, what's happening in the status quo, private insurance companies are able to collect the most data. The reason why is because they get paid to collect a lot of data, which is why, if anything, data collection operates the status quo, the incentive is on our side. Here's the problem. The second response comes from Keith. The reason why they're not able to, like, reason why they don't get a dealing is because the only data they're able to collect it according to the bill is going to be data on, like, the amount of, like, processors and how much you have to pay for things. Why this matters is because it's literally illegal for people to get private patient data and put them into a database. So this means they don't get access to any other link. But third, Bulgrovsky 14 notes that basically when you try and put everything into a big payment system, like a centralized system, it's going to be causing lawsuits because now that's seen as an encroachment of the government. Why this matters is because you're decreasing the amount of data collection on net because it's going to be, like, hurting that. But finally, fourth, we'd say on the impact level, like, they're talking about how, like, hospitals sharing each other. We'd say an economic downturn prerequisites this because basically that means you're not able to be able to adopt. But fourth, what's happening when the government encroaches on the market, there's going to be a decrease in the amount of investors. Whenever there's a decrease in the amount of investors, there's less people being able to develop AI. Why this matters is because if people can't develop AI, you can't put things in the system. Finally, the first question.
Sure. So let's talk about specifically, like, this employment thing because, like, they're writing off taxes. You might have cut out for me. How many jobs are specifically lost from, like, no longer having tax write-off?
My bad. 11.6 million.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, you can have another question because that was just clarification.
Okay, cool. So when we're specifically looking at, like, the private data collection, what sort of data is the private industry collecting, and, like, why is it, like, on at better quality?
We'd say it would be patient data. The reason why it's better, the reason why we're saying quality of data is probably the same, right? The difference is you have more incentive to collect more. Because you can actually do this not as part of the government, right? Because the government would be illegal for them. But secondly, right, is because that's how they get profit, right? The more data they collect on how like consumers are reacting to their drug or reacting to their treatments, the more they're able to analyze their profit, because they are able to profit for that. When you get rid of profit, you can't do that. Can I have a question though?
Sure.
Let's talk specifically. Yeah, let's talk about this United States Library Congress. When was that written?
Yeah. I mean, I assume you can tell me.
Yeah, it was written in it was written I don't know the exact date of that card, but I can tell you the study that it cites was written in 2009.
Okay.
What was the insurance looking like in 2009?
I mean, I can't tell you what it's looking like then, but I would say at the point where we established that costs are steadily increasing, the amount of people who aren't able to afford medicine is also increasing, because not only are people not able to buy insurance anymore, but they're having more and more their general costs.
I mean, I think we both. Yeah, I think we could both agree that drug companies are going to get the most amount of profit, quote unquote, for the people who don't have they're going to lose the most amount of profit for people who don't have insurance at that point, right? So, okay, never mind. I made my point.
Yeah,
you can have a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about your impact specifically on this developing world thing. How many people? Okay. Does your card specifically isolate that all of the lives saved are coming from the United States?
Which impact? Because we have a lot of impacts in the developing world.
I mean, it's the tiered pricing one.
Tiered pricing?
Yeah, vaccine average.
It's global.
Okay, so how much of the United States is contributing to this vaccine development? And if we pulled out, why would international institutions automatically fall?
So the nuance of our link isn't that it's U.S. companies, right? We go with the Goldman evidence that 80% of global pharmaceutical profits come from the U.S. So we impact the global pharmaceutical profits. If you came up here and you read 8 alt countries, our link would still stand. Can I have a question though?
Sure.
Yeah. When is this healthcare collapse going to happen?
Yeah, so we can't tell you exactly when a recession is going to happen. It's really not a fair bright line to give us, considering we could say it's going to happen next year and then be proven wrong. Most
if you had evidence,
predictions are pretty bad. Yeah, so what we do establish is currently the #1 healthcare risk, meaning it is posing the biggest threat to our economy. And we're
Sorry.
Trajectories will get us to the breaking point, and the two specific things we tell you is the 2033 for the premiums and 2060 for the economy.
So I'm sorry to cut you off because time's running late.
Significantly before that.
Yeah, time's running low, so I'm sorry to cut you off. The Byron evidence was written when?
Byron evidence? I can.
It was February 2017.
Yeah, it sounds about right. We give uniqueness specific to COVID though.
Sure.
So it establishes the trend is continuing in 2020.
Sure. Okay.
Easiest place to vote is our first contention about the collapse. This is because spending is increasing and increasing, which Altman finds will consume 100% of household income. The Lopez evidence goes conceded. Either A, we can deflate the bubble with government intervention, or B, we can allow healthcare costs to take up 50% of our economy, crowding out other sectors, pushing 900 million people into poverty because of a United States recession. First, they say that we don't have a bright line. The argument that we are saying is that a recession is inevitable. It's going to happen very, very soon because of the healthcare costs. It's going to happen any second. Then they read you 3 terms about how a recession is going to happen first in our world. First, they say speculation, but they've conceded that the deficit actually decreases on their case, which means that there's less bonds, which means that there's less speculation. The second term that they read is this Pipes evidence. However, Fishbaum of NASDAQ writes that a single-payer system doesn't mean entire companies will disappear. They will adapt and adjust to new reality rather than the outright failure of some businesses. We'll see gradual consolidation for more efficiency. Then they read you the Spiegel evidence that says that people write off taxes and this leads to 11.6 million jobs going away. Number one, they don't implicate exactly how that creates a recession, but number two, the trajectories on our side. Our argument is that healthcare is supposed to collapse within the next 5 years, which is why it prereqs their argument, because they don't give you any time frame on any 3 of their terms. Instead, you can look to our evidence that we read you on their case. The Nichols evidence goes conceded, which indicates that because there's an increased demand in the healthcare sector, 2.6 million jobs are created, $350 billion are created, and the United States economy grows by 1%, which equates to 1% growth in the developing world as well. That is conceded. Finally, they talk about investors on the impact level with the Jacobs evidence, but our argument is about consumer spending from the consumers who are spending way too much on healthcare costs. 2 reasons why this outweighs. First is magnitude. 900 million is bigger than any impact that they have provided you. But second is prereq. Even if you develop drugs and send them to the developing world, it doesn't matter because if people are in poverty, they simply cannot afford it. On our second contention about big data, we'll concede the Keith evidence that you can't pay for more personal things and the data is inefficient. This also kicks out all of their terms. Also, all of the terms that they read, there's no implication on any of them, so you really should not be evaluated. Let's go to their case. On On the second argument about on remittances, you can extend the NARA evidence, which goes conceded. We indicate that since there's going to be more patients and you're paid on a per patient basis, doctors would actually end up making more money. That's why the probability doesn't matter, because the United States system is different than the other countries that they talk about. On the second contention about medical innovation, the Sullivan evidence is kind of mishandled. Our argument is that medical technology is already being developed in the EU. The markets are already in the EU, and that's why people turn to the EU already. They say that the United States is a prerequisite. We would say no, because the EU is already developing. That's why the United States does not have any incentive at all. Finally, on the argument about subsidized care, they've conceded a couple things. First, we say from the Lichtenberg evidence that the middle class is growing by 300 billion annually, which is really important because that means that there's always an impact. There's always a market to go to in the developing world. This is cold conceded, which means that their link in about selling to the developing world at lower prices will always exist no matter what, because the market is there. They're always going to look to make profits, and that's how they're going to do it.
Cool. They were not ready. On the first link, they ghost extend this debt stat. There's no warrant or implication why it leads to an economic stimulus. It's super uncontextualized. Don't vote on it. Second link about remittances. They say that there's going to be more patients, that they're going to make more money. They try to extend this turn without giving an impact or an implication to the rest of the stuff. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. On the second contention about innovations, we're winning. Their narrative completely changes when they shift from EU to China, because China doesn't have private investors. It's a state-owned enterprise. It's completely different, and we would have responded to it if they had cited it correctly. Second, they don't say that people move to China, just that China is doing more innovations. They whole radically different point. At that point, extend the link chain. Whitman says right now the U.S. system is very open. That's why we have 2 times more MRI scanners than anyone else. Lutheran 19 says the HHS secretary under the Medicare-For-All bill has the discretion and can change what is covered and what is deemed medically necessary. That gives massive uncertainty in the market and basically and means that it's very hard to develop new innovations because you don't know whether it's going to be covered under the single-payer system. Cliff notes that money in the United States allows experiments to proliferate across the globe. Ultimately, the impact comes from hand, which says with new investments, we could save up to 10 million lives every year. Let's weigh this because we actually implicate into the developing world. You should prefer impacts to the developing world because of magnitude. We have a safety net in the United States that we don't have in other countries. They don't link in to the developing world because they don't extend a link from U.S. economy to developing countries in their summary. At that point, you automatically vote for us because we have a better magnitude. Even if it's intuitive, they don't extend it. You shouldn't grant them ghost extensions. But we prereq the economy because a technological boon will see massive increase in the economy and benefits across the globe. On C3, they say middle class grow. First, we say the Finn evidence is pretty good. It says they maximize profits at the top 10%. But second, it wasn't Rebel. On the affirmative case, though, at the top, they try to say that the defense on Struble is specific to debt. It isn't. It is, as we read it in the rebuttal from Struble, it says that there's massive uncertainty when everything goes from a private to a public sector. People don't know what is going to be privatized, where the money is going, and what happens with the industries afterwards. At that point, we're going to see massive uncertainty in the stock market, and that's why 11 out of the last 12 recessions were because of this uncertainty. We give you the time frame weighing. Healthcare costs only deflate after about 4 years, whereas this recession happens immediately. Yeah. On the pipes stuff, yeah, they say single payer doesn't mean disappear. It means that there's going to transition. The evidence is very explicit. The pipes evidence says it hurts the bubble in the economy because it eliminates private insurance, which is a fifth of the market immediately. It literally says that we're going to lay 2 million people off the second when you affirm because their industry completely disappears. You can't transition away from private industry, which you've been doing for hundreds of years, to like something else. At the impact, 900 million is a bad impact. First, they don't link into the developing world. Again, don't give them the extension. Second, they still get treatment in poverty. It's not a question of being in poverty doesn't give you treatment. It's just quality of treatments. We'd say the best link into people would be to have the treatments available, because stuff like if hospitals don't have the required innovations or medical technology, it affects everyone, not just the people that are uninsured.
All right, you all ready for Grand Cross?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We'll cover like medical technology.
Sure.
So aside from like MRIs, what else is there, and how exactly does that prevent 10,000 deaths?
Sure. Great question. Not just MRIs. You have like more advanced hospital machines. You can have like AI integrated hospital machines.
What does that mean? Like what is advanced
yeah.
hospital machine?
Okay, if you want the internal link for like how you can have more AI integrated like machines, for example, like there's not just MRIs. There's like different CAT scans. There's many other ways, right?
Right.
So what the enhancement evidence accounts for is that when you have like this like investment and have good innovation medical technology, this would make it sure that like it's more efficient, so it's easier for people to do it. But also too, it asks for like better detections, which stops for like many of these diseases or many of these problems that are like pre-existing. It will help detect them early, be able to stop that. Can we have a question?
That's how that's how medical technology works, and that's how it prevents 10 million deaths.
I mean, are you going to tell me otherwise? Because that's what sorry, Lars.
Yeah, so we implicate that like other countries start adopting U.S. innovations. That's why it leads to our impact. Can I have a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So on this stuff about China, so is China state-owned, right? So why would investors start looking towards Chinese medical technology?
We'll concede the response, but if we're winning our pre-work, we also win your argument. Can I get
Okay, so we can just consider it. Okay, it's irrelevant. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about like this 2 million layoffs, right?
Yeah.
You say it happens immediately, but you don't explain why that triggers a recession. So why does that trigger a recession?
Yeah. So it's the Sugar. You can go.
It's 1/5 of the market.
Yeah. That's
how's that a warrant as to why a recession happens?
Sure, because when you lose 1/5 of the industry when it collapses, that has spillover effects on the rest. Because like a lot of companies rely on people having jobs, for example. They rely on this market share that just immediately evaporates.
That wasn't in summary though.
That's what we give. We tell you that it's 1/5 the economy, and therefore it's going to collapse the rest of the sector.
2 million jobs, so you don't implicate as how does that lead to a recession faster than
we did. Maybe you cut out or something, but we definitely did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Online debates are favorite thing ever.
Oh, are we doing questions?
Yeah.
Do y'all gotta go to school tomorrow?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
do you have a question? Be courteous.
All right. Is it okay with all the judges if we just use the remaining minute for prep?
It's 35 seconds, but yeah.
Okay.
Is that okay with everyone? Okay, cool.
Right. We have 30.
It's just going to be our case weighing. Okay, in that case, time starts now. Our case is a pretty simple argument. The healthcare industry is on the verge of collapse. Our Altman evidence establishes that premiums are currently going on the trend to rise to 100% of current income. And Howard explains that this is directly leading to a decrease in consumer spending, which is crowding out 50% of the economy because 50% of the economy is now taken up by healthcare costs. That's important because our Lopez evidence gives the binary comparison. Either the government is able to deflate these costs with a policy such as Medicare-For-All, or we continue to go into the recession, which a recession is going to happen within the next few years. That's really important because we established in Trace Extends in summary that U.S. is the global linchpin for the entire economy, meaning that if something happens in the United States, it's going to be happening in other countries as well. That's really critical because it means we'll lead to a 900 million people going into poverty across the globe. It's a pretty conceded impact. When we look through his two links, the problem is none of it warranting for how either of these leads to a recession happens in summary. But first, let's talk about this one on like uncertainty right now. I would say there's uncertainty currently happening with all of this policies with the healthcare sector. That's a big issue in the first place. But then second, uncertainty isn't going to happen for two reasons. One, Sjostrom establishes that you're not going to have an immediate decline in these sectors because they're going to be able to pivot to other areas. Even if private insurance is gone, it doesn't mean private insurance companies are gone. They're going to be able to go into other sectors at the same time. But then they concede our Nichols evidence, which means they cannot win any of their impacts. Because at the point where Nichols establishes that this is an economic stimulus for years to come, increasing the demand for jobs by 2.6 million and increasing the amount of money in the economy by 350 billion, this means that it is a stimulus package that mitigates all impacts of their recessions in their world. That's critical because Straits establishes this is not only leads to a mitigation of their recession impacts, but it also leads to developing world benefits because it goes conceded that a 1% increase in the GDP in the United States leads to a 1% increase in the GDP in the developing world. This literally proves not only the linchpin argument, but it literally gives us our link into that 900 million because we established that there is a direct GDP link between the United States and the developing world. That means that our magnitude weighing still stands. If we're talking about the developing world, we still need to be looking towards the biggest impact on these people. But second, our prereq is really important because we established that if you are in a poverty and rich community, you're not able to one, afford drugs in the first place, or two, there's not going to be investment in these health infrastructure and these drugs going to do in the first place because you don't have enough money to either pay for it or fund the investment into these medical technologies, meaning that our impact will always prereq there if you're not going to have any benefits to these 10 million people.
Now that they've conceded their China response, our link is 100% strength of link. You should be voting on strength of link before anything else to a policy. That's the only way to decrease judge intervention. Our Whitman evidence is very good that tells you the U.S. has 2 times as many medical technology devices than anyone else in the world. Why this matters is because whatever you affirm, what's going to be happening is that your HHS can change what's covered between each presidency. That's why there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty means that there's going to be a pullout on the market. What matters here is the prerequisite that they drop. The prerequisite Lars gives you, it basically ends the round. It basically tells you that if we have more investments, it means that we can have a technology boom, and we have a technology boom that basically creates a massive economic growth, which solves back for any recession impacts they have, but also B, in the long term, is going to be generating more economic growth for the United States, which turns their impact and acts as a fundamental prerequisite. Both of these were conceded. Strength of link comes first. It's very easy for you to vote neg. With that said, let's go to the AF case. We're going for the Struble turn. The Struble turn tells you that what's happening is when you change everything from private sector to a public sector, that's going to be causing a lot of uncertainty and speculatory investment on the market. And when speculatory investment increases, that's going to increase the risk of recession, because it means the volatility in the market increases, which is why 11 out of the 12 last recessions were predated by this. Their response and final focus was that private insurance doesn't go. This isn't private insurance. These are investor companies. They're investing in healthcare stocks, which is why the impact still triggers. And the weighing we give on this is also conceded. Time frame. We don't know when their recession is going to be triggering, but we know as soon as you affirm these investor stocks are going to be going crazy, which is why there's an increase in the amount of economic downturn here. You weigh this, like, the weighing itself is, like, conceded there. Let's go to their prereq weighing. They say you cannot afford, there's less investment when there's a recession. They drop both of Lars's front line. A, you can still afford it, because this is mostly going to be hospitals, and these are going to be people who, like, even in poverty, you can still, like, afford technology, but B, these are hospitals buying it. These aren't, like, people. It doesn't matter about poverty. But the second thing we tell you about investments is A, new and final focus, but what we tell you about this, why this matters, is going to be specifically because, like, what is it called, investors, like, they don't always go with the recession. We don't know if this recession is going to happen, especially when it comes to recession recovery. The only thing we know is that when investors happen, when Medicare-For-All happens, when there's a radical change that they themselves tell you, that means investors are going to pull out, it's going to hurt medical technology, it's going to decrease the economy. All in all, our link is conceded. It's much easier for you to vote neg.